Hello and good evening. I apologize. Thank you so much for coming out. My name is Sara Cochran and I am Chief Curator here at the church. However, whatever I plan and whatever I do means nothing if you, the public, don't show up. But even more importantly, if these four individuals had not been here and installed the work, it wouldn't have happened. So this is an event that I am incredibly happy about. I have an idea that in the profession of the art world, what we do is we present you with lovely, perfect objects. And I think sometimes people don't know how much work and how much creativity goes into actually installing the artwork. So tonight is really a way to honor the enormous contribution of these four individuals, but also the individuals who work in other places in their roles. So I'm going to give just four quick formal introductions, and then it will be a much more informal conversation. We're quite a small group, so if you really do have a burning question, let's make this a conversation. And if we really do feel that we would like to see some of the details up close, we could also do a little walkabout and go and see some of these pieces. So now I have to put on my glasses. 1 second. And in alphabetical order, Ward Ackerman, all the way to the far end. He owns and operates Red Knot, LLC. He is recognized for his skillful installations of artworks, working with collectors here on the East End as well as New York City. And he works, along with Kerry, for almost all of the institutions out here. If you have been to any of the institutions out here, you have seen their behind the scenes work. On top of all of that experience, he previously worked for 20 years with Pace Gallery, and he worked, for our purposes today, with Keith Saunier in his studio for about 8 years. And the importance of that will become apparent during our talk. Sara Heinemann, who is here next to me, is a New York-based artist whose paintings, drawings, site-specific installations celebrate the potential of modernist abstraction through process, play, improvisation. She attended Smith College, holds an MFA from painting from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and an MFA from Hunter College. She has shown around the country and also internationally in places such as Brazil. She has worked with the Sol LeWitt Studio. I don't know what that was. That's okay.
Microphone.
She's worked for the Sol LeWitt Studio since, she worked with Sol LeWitt since 2000, realizing Sol LeWitt wall drawings for museums, galleries, and private collections. James Miller, who is next to her, is a Brooklyn-based painter whose practice draws heavily from the history of photographic and light-based media in both method and aesthetics. He translates the rhetoric of an additive light process to the subtractive color medium. He received his BFA from Laguna College of Art and Design in 2009 and his MFA from Yale in 2014. He was also a Daedalus Foundation Fellow in 2015. His paintings have also been shown in the United States and Europe, and he's worked with Jim Lambie since 2014. Lastly, but not least, Kerry-Sharkey Miller is an artist, photographer, and respected art installer. She has an extensive background in fine arts and media production. She also owned and operated an art gallery specializing in Native American artists for 14 years. She holds a BFA in photography from the Long Island University, and as I said, her work as an installer has graced the halls of homes and museums here in the East End. Thank you so much for being here. And now I will try to navigate onto the stage. So, I think one of the first things that is interesting for me is the fact that you all have a deep understanding and implication in art. May I ask you each to talk about when you realized art was important to you? Is somebody going to go first, or do I have to pick? James, you're reaching for the microphone.
Oh, I was just going to get ready. I guess for me, it just kind of came at a very early age, and I didn't grow up in a metropolitan city. I grew up in Spokane, Washington, so my gateway to art was through family friends who were into car painting and things like that, so I got into it through airbrushing and different ways like that. And then I think the big thing that clicked for me was I had a background in construction growing up and as a teenager, and I got to, in a roundabout way, I ended up working for Michael Asher in LA on a major installation that was a kind of architectural intervention and at the Santa Monica Museum, and that kind of blew my mind and made me want to get more involved in contemporary art. So I've been working for artists since then and on my own practice. So, yeah.
I would say that also sort of a childhood moment where I realized how amazing it was to play, and I wanted to keep playing. And I grew up in Chicago, so the Art Institute of Chicago played a fairly prominent part of what we would do on weekends. And yeah, I just never stopped sort of being curious and excited about it.
The microphone, you actually have to hold it up.
Oh, okay.
My family has a pretty strong art background. My mother's a painter, and my grandfather was a painter and photographer and kind of all-around tinkerer. So I was always exposed to art as a really young age. I was interested in photography from a very young age. My grandfather gave me my first camera. And I actually dropped out of high school because they wouldn't let me study photography, and went on to college where they did let me study photography. And so it's always, kind of been in my background and a strong influence in my life.
It's hard to say how I got into art. I went to school, studied art, went to New York, tried to be an artist, struggled with that, had to get a job, got a job at Crozier Fine Arts, and I started, going around installing art. So that was the way that I made my living, and I think after a while my career didn't quite go the direction that I wanted to, so I more or less fell into this sort of thing, putting other people's art up on the wall.
Sorry, I turned it off. You all have a close relationship to, at least in this show, the artists that you are interpreting their work. Sara, you have a very funny story about your first interaction with Sol LeWitt.
I can't remember.
It was a deinstall of a Sol LeWitt.
Oh, yes, my first, that's funny because I thought you were talking about my actual interaction with him. Actually, before I met Sol, it was the summer that I had graduated college, and I, kind of in the theme of all of us staying within the art world, you just sort of hustle for any work you can get that's adjacent. And I was helping Rona Hoffman Gallery, which was the gallery in Chicago that represented Sol. And she had a piece of his in the lobby, and I was helping the gallery move. And so before I even met Sol, I had the opportunity to paint over one of his pieces. And then it was later that summer that I joined the LeWitt team. So it was a backwards sort of introduction.
Ward, can you talk a little bit about how you actually met Keith and how you started to work in his studio?
Well, I was living in New York for quite a while. I was working at Pace Gallery for over 20 years, and Keith was part of the gallery at that time. I didn't know him, and then I decided that I didn't want to live in the city anymore, and we came out here to live full time. And I didn't really have anything planned to work on out here, and a person at the gallery suggested Keith as an option. He was looking for an assistant, and I said, sure. And yeah, it's been a great experience. I think what my experience has been, especially with working at Pace, is just the number of artists that I've been able to work with. Just really some real assholes, but some real geniuses, and real people you wanted to just, like glom onto, and I just learned so much. And not only that, but also the director of the Pace Gallery, and you just learn the finer things about what it is to install a gallery show. What looks good, what doesn't look good, how to make something, move something just a few inches that way or this way, or change a painting, can really, this is something obviously you do for a living, but it's not something you can just pick up like that. It's something that really needs to be, your eye really needs to be taught how to do that. And I feel very fortunate that I have done that. And then working for Keith was a much different experience because I was with him every day. It was just the two of us, right? And sometimes it would be a good day, sometimes it would be a bad day. But what I got to see was his process. And with Keith, he's one of these artists he's been hands-on early in his career, but later on, and I think a lot of artists, especially when they get very big and they have people who actually make their art. And so I got to make his art. I mean, literally, he would give me a little Post-it and do a little squiggle on it, make some suggestions about what he would like it to look like. And then I'd go off for the next 3 days and come back and say, what do you think? So at a certain point, we were able to work simpatico and develop some kind of, at some point it was kind of odd too, because I felt like, is this my art or is that his art? But I think it was his art, and really what he said it was a collaboration.
I want to get onto that part about this collaboration because, you are really entrusted to make very large decisions about the artist. And perhaps, James, you can mention just briefly how you met Jim Lambie and then talk about this staircase because it is quite unusual in Jim Lambie's work.
Sure, yeah. I'd love to get into that, and maybe you can help guide me with any questions if I'm going on too long. But post-graduate school, I moved to the city and pretty much immediately started working for a dealer called Anton Kern, who is in Manhattan, and he's based in Midtown. And currently, there's a show of Jim Lambie's work up that just opened last night. So it's kind of exciting timing to have this up. And Jim was one of the first artists in the program at Anton Kern who I met and worked with, and I immediately clicked with Jim and with his studio team from Scotland. They're based in Glasgow, but they were in town to work on a massive installation. Jim doesn't do modest projects. Everything is really exuberant and crazy and involves all-nighters and a lot of collaboration. So I loved the energy and just stayed very tight with the studio. So ever since that experience in 2014, I've been one of his, kind of an extension of the studio based in the US. So I suppose to give a little bit of a quick rundown of what this piece on the stairs is related to is a long-running series that I think was first shown in 1999 of floor-based sculptural interventions that are made by hand, drawing line by line in colored tape, colored vinyl tape, a circuit that traces and responds to the architectural boundary that's set by the artist or the institution. So if you haven't seen it yet, if you walk up and down these stairs, you'll see that we decided on a kind of structure to do this color pattern within. And it's a series that is called Zobop. The first one was in 1999 in Glasgow at Transmission Gallery, and that was an artist-run space that Jim was invited to do a project in, and they did an experiment with this tape drawing, starting from the outside perimeter of the room and winding in concentric circuits of color to build this giant pattern that closed on itself. And that kind of began this long-running series of variations of that idea. And I saw Jim last night, and I kind of asked for an update. I've heard a lot of different anecdotes about where that name Zobop came from, and he said that when they were installing the piece at Transmission Gallery, the director asked what the piece was called, and apparently he looked outside the window across the street. There was a dumpster with some neon pink spray paint graffiti written on the dumpster that said Zobop, and so he took that and immortalized it. So that's the name of the series. So I suppose maybe to get back to your question about collaboration, I'd love to get more in depth into the work and the process, but it's sort of a piece that functions kind of like a collaboration, but I think of it more like it's kind of a score. It's like a score for music in a way, and I get to be the musician that plays it or executes it. So Jim, as the artist, studies the space and the blueprints of the space where it's going to be, and organizes his thinking around a kind of sequence of color and a set of rules about varying shape and interval, and then kind of distributes all of that color information and material to the artists or artisans or volunteers. In this case, we had volunteers helping, and we kind of get to be the performers making on-the-fly decisions within that set of rules. So it's going to be different every time this piece gets made in a new space. And I think, you can't really do it wrong. But Jim has input as we're working through it and kind of gives us some guidance so that we make sure we're hitting the right tone of the piece. So in that way, there's a lot of freedom and chance kind of built into it. He's never the kind of artist who would model this out in Google SketchUp and give us a schematic. It's much more important that it feels handmade and that the energy going into it is live.
Can you talk a wee bit more about that? Because with the volunteers, you did talk about the fact that it should look handmade as opposed to something mechanical. And can you talk also about the fact that the stairway was open? So my understanding of how Jim deals with this language is that it is pools of color.
Sure. So I guess the first kind of the starting point of the work, for me, I kind of understand it to be broken into maybe three different components that create this work. You have the room or the architectural space, the material and the set of rules, and then the kind of active performance of making the piece. And typically, the architecture is usually a big floor or a space like, I've done many staircases, maybe I think I've done 9 or 10. And they're almost always stairs that are continuous in that they have a step and a riser. And so what you would normally see on a stairway is a kind of cascade of color that's falling down and continuing, so the geometry is all connected from top to bottom. And this is the first one that we've ever seen that is not built that way. So these stairs are floating, and we did a lot of back and forth before I came up here. The studio and I were talking about this, how to deal with it, and where we would define each frame for the drawing. And so in a room, if we were going to do this floor, we would start from the outside and work for days and days until the lines closed in the middle of the room into a pool of color. And that would be the piece. In this case, I think we have 21 individual rectangular pools that close in, and they all relate to each other, but they don't connect and flow. So that was kind of a fun challenge. So with the volunteers and I had to constantly communicate with each other and with the studio in Glasgow by video chat to just make sure that we were trying to maintain as much chaos and randomness as possible and not repeat ourselves in sequential color relationships. So we wanted to make this piece as unique and differentiated as possible. So it was a lot of planning for each step as we were going. And I had 2 great volunteers helping me, so I would kind of be, Jim's mouthpiece to say, okay, we need to do, these are the next 3 colors on that stair, you go here and, you jump up 4 steps, so we're not tripping over each other and work on those. And we were kind of doing this relay thing to kind of build each color pool and close it in. So that was kind of the process for that, which was really exciting. And we all love how this one turned out because it's very unique. Normally there's a lot of connectivity, and in certain rooms that are irregular shapes, we might have those pools close out in a couple of different places, but never this much. So this is kind of a one-of-a-kind one.
We love it too, so thank you. Sarah, can you talk about the process of the wall drawings? And I would like you to talk about the fact that you are part of a coterie of extraordinary individuals who do these wall drawings, but you don't necessarily all do all of the wall drawings. You have a kind of specialization.
Yes, we do all have a specialization. We can all do all of the wall drawings. Right now there's about 6 of us around the world that live in between Europe and the United States. Wow, what James was saying, I had so many things to respond to, and thinking how the Lambie and the LeWitt relate to each other in terms of what it is to be the assistant of somebody who can still make decisions and who can still be there to make the decisions versus the LeWitt, which the process has been codified. And there is, so the assistants play the part of LeWitt, or play the part of, well, back that up. The metaphor that you used about being a musician to the composer, is the exact metaphor that I use, because I think it's so useful to illustrate the relationship of, it's not a mechanical process where, right, like we were saying, I'm installing something that is going to look like this. We don't know what it's going to look like. So much is dictated by the architecture, by the hand, by the process. And so it does feel like I am not an equal part, but I'm an artist that is playing the composition of the idea that Sol has conceived of. I started working for the estate when they were codifying this material. and so became really adept at it. And so it became my specialization. It's a acrylic wash overlaid. Sol would have made a drawing, and each form has it's based on gray, red, yellow, blue, and those three colors and the gray tone are overlaid in the order that he writes on the plan. Each letter corresponds to a certain number of passes of a thin wash, and so that's how the color is slowly developed. And so you could imagine that there's lots of factors that will change what the color looks like. Some people have heavy hands, some people have light hands. Depending on how the wall has been prepared, sometimes the wash will take the color one way, sometimes it won't. So you do get lots of variations, but those variations all play out in the process and in the architecture. And it's funny because I think that I have tension. I feel the tension when I'm installing them because I do think that they're, it's conceptual art, and I think that Sol was really interested in the sort of democratic hand that anybody can make a piece of artwork if the instructions are followed, and like a very rational process. But actually within that, I find there to be a lot of irrationality and a lot of personality in maybe the nuance of the artists that are actually kind of in the same way. So I, have the experience behind me, but I will often work with assistants who have never done it before, and so there's a learning curve that happens with somebody who has a new hand that they're adding to the piece, and that will change the piece. So I think that though Sol had a specific idea of what he wanted the pieces to look like, there is also, there's a generosity in giving that over to other artists. And it's complicated now because he's no longer living. So when he was alive, I would make phone calls and ask questions, and there would be more of a relationship where I would get a yes or no. And now I sort of have to take that decision-making on, which is interesting because I don't want to project Sara into the piece. Like, I need to figure out where I'm in the piece and where Sol's in the piece.
You mentioned that environmental factors can also change a piece. You were talking about sometimes shadows, which I found very interesting, like shadows of the scaffolding.
Yes, that has happened. Well, with these pieces, light plays a huge part, and lighting is always an enemy when I'm doing these installations, because in the process, one of the things Sol did want was them to have not a flatness, but like a veil of color, so that there's some push and pull, but that airiness, that airy quality. And I've had plenty of situations where a permanent scaffold, while I'm making the work, is removed, and we have the optical illusion that we did have a flat veil of color was actually not a flat veil of color. But that's fun. I mean, I guess that's part of it. Process.
Can you talk also just about the name and the technique of this particular type of wall drawing?
Yes. So this technique, it's a combination of wiping these thin washes on the wall, and then something that was made up by one of Sol's assistants, and it's called the Boom Boom. We call it Boom Boom. And it is in the catalogs and in the instructions. And it was developed in the early 80s by an assistant in Italy who was left-handed, and his nickname was Boom Boom Mancini, after the left-handed Italian boxer. And it's in the books.
It's official.
It's official.
So if we turn to Carrie and to Ward and talk again about this reinterpretation of a piece by Keith Sonnier, we have had a few individuals query the date of this piece, which is 2004, because that obviously postdates Keith's death. Sorry, 2024. But can you both talk about, how you conceived of this piece? It was originally conceived for a corridor and became, installed here in the library. But also, I've had the enormous pleasure to work with both of you on almost all of our installations. So you are two individuals who know this space well. Can you talk about how you decided, the decisions that you made to reconfigure this piece?
Well, you made the decision for us.
I didn't decide. I talked to Olympia, Keith Sonnier's daughter, about where it should go, and she agreed it should go in the library, and then you chaps installed it.
Can I just read what Keith said about this piece?
Yes. Could you use your microphone?
Yes. Okay, so just as a background, this piece has been installed. This is it was installed first in France, Nice, France, in 2015, I think. Then it was installed.
I'm sorry, Ward. Can you hold?
Then it was installed in at the parish, right?
Yeah.
At the parish, and then it went to Louisiana, and then it's come here. So I'll just read this short. It's no big deal. This is called Passage Azur. So Keith is Cajun, born Cajun, Louisiana, small town Louisiana. So his Acadian French heritage. So he's very French in some ways. And he's also very well known in France as an artist, and Europe more so, I think, than the United States. The curves and circular shapes in Passage Azur are inspired by waves. To me, these undulating forms function like code images for movement through time and space. At the parish, these shapes, part geometric, part biomorphic, suspended from the architectural structure at the museum's spine, simulate a kind of ocean activity woven into the building's architecture. So that's what he said. So I'm kind of following that in a funny sort of way. I mean, the idea originally, when he had this idea of a passage, a hallway, and you go from one space to the next, and then above that, if you've probably all been to the parish, you know the spine, and that's where it was installed. But and then in every other venue, it's been in a hallway. But this is the first time it's not a hallway, right? So Keith is no longer with us, so we decided that, how does this, so he was invested with the architecture in all these spaces, so we took this architecture and in this space, and while I don't know if you'd want to call it a passage, but it is a flowing thing. It's sort of
like a pathway. Yeah.
A pathway. I think we were thinking about it as if the water were coming into an eddy, as if it were hitting a side, coming back around, and then shooting back the other side, instead of just flowing in a straight line. Mm-hmm. Not unlike the way these are going here. They've hit an embankment, so to speak. So, but I think it's in keeping with his feeling about how the piece should be displayed. I'm interpreting it. Mm-hmm. I think he would have been okay with this. I don't think he would have been upset, but who's to say, right? So I think, right?
Yeah, I think, we just we had installed it together at the parish. And Keith was there when we installed it, so he did come in. So, and he was pretty loose with.
It was funny because he was in a wheelchair and we would push him, and he said, I need a laser pointer. So they actually got him a laser pointer, which I thought was a huge mistake, but they got him and so we were all up on scaffoldings, and we had run wires all the way through, and then he would pick a piece of neon, and he would say, with the laser pointer, put it over there. Put one over there. But it was more like playtime. It wasn't like he was like so rigid about it that it had to be that blue next to that green or this shape next to that shape. But I think we all kind of, like you, we get into the, I don't want to be, but we got into the flow of it, not to be.
He kind of laid out a very loose framework and left it to us to fill in all the gaps. You know, he just kind of pointed out a few key pieces, and then we were left to interpret the rest of it.
That's true, right.
And like the little orbs, those were specific, those were added for the parish, and different elements, and that was just kind of, he was basically just kind of drawing in space.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
He was having fun. We were all having fun. He was a very fun guy. So he made it very entertaining to do it. And you know, when you have that going, it's like, okay, I don't feel, you know, neon you think is, oh, it's so, you got to be so careful. You say, don't care. You break it, I don't care. You know, so you didn't feel like there was something precious about it, especially since it was neon. And I feel that way today. I don't, you know, you see the way I swing the neon around, you're kind of like, whoa. But I don't, it's not something to feel like, you know, because you can always replace it. And not only that, it's not that precious, even though it looks or can be the sensibility of it could be precious.
Yeah, it's scary for a lot of people.
Yeah, it is scary.
So I have a specific question for both of you, because I want to know how you knew when you were finished, because you didn't use all of the neon tubes.
No, we didn't. I think we just kind of set, you know, we had that finite space.
It felt enough.
Yeah. And, you know, we felt like at a certain point it was, it's tricky too, because we're working with it with the lights off.
Oh yeah, that's a good point.
So we're not seeing the colors that you're seeing now when we're working with it. So it's, you know, it was always kind of a nice surprise when we figured out how.
Well, and it's a big surprise, because if we don't have it wired right, we're like, what the hell did we do wrong?
Yeah. And it's a tricky piece to wire too, because these tubes are really long, and with neon you have to have a closed circuit. You come from a transformer to a bulb that starts it, and then you have to keep a continuous loop and then go back to the transformer. So it is, when you're dealing with these big long loopy pieces, it was sometimes a little tricky to keep track of, you know, which ones. It was always a surprise as to how many tubes you can put on a particular transformer. Is based on their shape and you know, the length of the tubes. There's a certain amount that a transformer can handle. So it was a lot of just kind of playing, trying it out, and hoping it worked.
I have a question really quick about that then. Would you guys have changed anything? When the lights come up, would you have edited it?
No, we kind of got it.
Yeah, we were pretty happy. I think we plugged it in at certain points as we went. We started out at this end, and we would plug it in, and so we had a sense of where the colors were, and the tubes do say what color they are, but you don't really get a sense of how bright the color is or how intense it is. Like there's a couple different greens, a couple different blues. So we were trying to give it a good variation of color, I'd say, right, as we were going along, and trying to mix it up, you know, and then we did get to plug it in at certain points, but we didn't really have the whole thing going until we had the whole piece installed. We didn't really have a sense of how the whole thing did come together.
I have a question now for all of the panelists. What is the future for these works? I mean, we're here with a real variation. I mean, obviously, Sarah, with Sol LeWitt, there's some pretty clear instructions. Obviously, James, for you, Jim is alive. You know, but how are we going to do the notation to go forward into the future? And I guess I would ask you to have you thought about, has the estate thought about how some of these neon pieces, which are a bit more loose, how they will be installed, 50, 100 years into the future?
No.
Yeah.
One thing, I think there is an issue, and that's technology. So, for instance, Keith made works where, you remember the old incandescent frosted top light bulbs, right? They don't make them anymore. Yeah. And a lot of his work depends on those light bulbs. Neon, I suspect people will keep making neon unless they decide that it's some kind of a health hazard, and they don't. I mean, there's mercury in it. I mean, but there are limitations. Your paint, Benjamin Moore, are they going to be making these colors forever?
Yeah, the estate has been dealing with the formulas change, yeah, and the yellow leads. That's been a really big problem to source.
But you're
Paints
right.
change.
50 years or 60 years from now, they will not be the same.
They're trying to.
They may not have the same consistency. There's going to be something different that's going to change what you can do. So I guess that's what you're saying. 50 or 60 years. I mean, who knows? I mean, it may not exist. I mean.
Sorry, there's a question from Dale, and then we can hear from you, James.
Sure, yeah. So I have a question I can talk loud enough. So, you ready? So I have a question for Sarah. So thank you. So very specifically, these are all site-specific pieces that have a certain amount of variation that will happen. I actually installed at Yale a Sol LeWitt years ago, and I installed a big Richard Serra installation. So it's but things like when you call up and say, I want you to do something for the staircase, and I want a Sol LeWitt, and you specifically know what that's going to look like, and theoretically that will be something. So this really in a didactic way, how do you do that? So do you call and say, we have a $100,000 budget and you can paint the thing? Or when you borrow a painting, it's kind of pretty straightforward, but you're not borrowing a painting, you're borrowing an idea. So I'm just curious how you figure that out.
It's a kind of long process. I mean, for the Sol LeWitt, I mean, there was a 2-week process to prepare the wall before Sarah came. I had installed a Sol LeWitt previously at the Phoenix Art Museum, so I kind of knew the drill, but there is this very scary line that if the wall isn't properly done, they'll walk away and they won't install the artwork. So there's a certain amount of incentive to make sure that's right. We were initially thinking about the Sol LeWitt on this wall, and there's a foot difference in height between this and this wall. This wall is slightly more square. There were 2 reasons we switched walls. One was that these walls, you can see that our walls are built of panels, and we did that. It was my colleague Tom Brokish. The idea was to try to have an installation technique for walls that didn't mean we were putting up sheetrock and taking them down for every installation. We were trying to be a little lighter in our ecological footprint. So we were definitely thinking about these walls. Now, the problem with these walls is obviously you have the lines running through them. This wall, there's been a lot more give in it. And at one point we realized, it's not standing directly on the ground. I mean, it stands on those little feet, so there's probably a lot more give on that wall. So that was certainly when we realized that with the wall, this wall is much more stable. We were also concerned that if we went through this and did the 2 layers of level 5 plastering, that, you know, if a heavy truck or something, an earthquake, who would have thought of it, you know, would it crack? And that was a question you had also when you actually did this, the circle, was would it crack? So that was also there. And then with Christine's piece, you know, this was a wild card. We've never installed, this has never been installed before. So we reckoned having that piece over there, seeing it coming up from the staircase, that was a very, very good piece for it. So we prepared the wall, organized for Sara and her assistant Yvonne to come out. It was 11 days?
Yeah, 11 days.
At the same time, we reached out to Anton Kern and said, you know, we'd really love a Jim Lambie. And they explained that there was this extraordinary individual called James Miller who could come and help us. We did have a budget crunch, and I am eternally grateful to Christoph and Anton Kern for working with us. So the reason that James so graciously worked with 2 extraordinary volunteers from our community was because it was a way of bringing down the budget. So I'm very grateful to James, and I'm very grateful to the gallery. And then obviously for the Keith Saunier, knowing Ward put me in touch with Olympia. Olympia came down, looked at it. She sent me some of the works that it could be installed, and then I talked about that space, and she said, you know, she wanted to talk to Ward, and then they would come back. So the 5th member of the panel who should perhaps be here would be Joe Diamond, who works at the Southampton Art Centre. He is the one who actually figured out the logistics of how we got the weight of water, which is this rope piece, up. But it really is a lot of discussion and just making sure that we had everything we needed. So, yeah. But now I'd like James to talk about the future of Jim Lambie.
Sure. Well, the question, I might take the question in a slightly different direction, because I think for me, in getting to know this work, there's kind of an interesting way of thinking about the lifespan and the future of each one of the Zobop pieces. I think as a series and as a practice, Jim's practice, as you know, for future generations, I think it's fairly self-explanatory how it's going to continue and be able to be installed based on these systematic ways of working. But kind of connected to what you were saying about not treating the neon as this precious thing, the work has kind of an interesting lifespan and wear and tear aspect to it. So if you, as a collector, if you buy a Jim Lambie Zobop edition like this piece, and you have it installed by me or whoever on your stairs in your house, we go and we make that out of this sign maker's vinyl, which is colored vinyl tape. And again, it's not precious at all. It's a really cheap, ready-at-hand material, and that material kind of, the origin of using that goes back to Jim Lambie's father had a sign making company in Glasgow. So this was just extra crap that was around, and he started making art out of it. So so it's not a precious material. It's a very durable material, but this piece will exist in one space at one time. So if you have me install this in your house in New York, and then you decide you're moving and you want to bring this work with you to LA, we rip it up and destroy it and then make it again in LA. So it's not a permanent thing. But what's interesting about the future and the lifespan of this work is that it is kind of treated like semi-permanent. We make this work with the vinyl directly on the stairs or on floors, and people walk on it all day, every day, and use it. it becomes part of the architecture, and it's not treated in a way that's elevated. Like Jim prefers to never put protective coatings on top of it or things, which is always an interesting conversation that I have to have with a collector in their house, because they're paying me to fly out and build this thing on their stairs, and they're like, you know, I'm 9 days into it out of 10 days, and they say, great, how are you gonna protect the stairs? And I say, well, I'm not, we don't like to do that. And so if it gets a little worn in or roughed up or ripped, we actually love that about it, because it's kind of got this life and touch kind of built into it. And Jim's kind of talked about that as functioning kind of like a good pair of jeans, that it gets kind of broken in over time, and it becomes more and more interesting looking. So I think those things about the work, you know, it's very indebted to, like Sol LeWitt was a big influence on Jim. So there's a kind of rigidity and logic built into it, but there's also this kind of sort of punk, scrappy attitude to it, that it doesn't have to be this pristine, permanent, you know, piece. It can be ripped up and transplanted and made again somewhere else, and it'll look different in that situation. It can be updated and patched and touched up. So the kind of the future and the kind of life of this piece is always different, you know.
I think the question of technology is a really interesting one. Nanjun Pike, you know, worked with what were usually outdated televisions, and obviously now with flat screens, you know, we're dealing with a technology that is archaic. The interesting thing about Nanjun Pike is that the Korean government realized that if they didn't step in, they were going to lose probably their most famous contemporary artist. And so the Korean government has actually financed the conservation of Nanjun Pike pieces all around the world, including in the United States. They sometimes keep the televisions functioning. They sometimes keep just the aesthetics of the old televisions by putting in a flat screen, but keystoning the image. But it is, I think, to your point, Ward, a really, really interesting question. I want to open up to audience questions, but just before I do that, I did want to ask each one of you how working with another artist has affected your artistic practice or how you look at art.
I guess I'll say that when I first started working for the studio, I was a young artist and very confused about how to separate the day job aspect of it with being sort of enveloped into the process. And now I've just kind of allowed it to seep as it needs to. I love color, and I love realizing the complexity of the colors of his pieces, and I let that kind of be part of what my own work is. And I don't worry about, I'm not a conceptual artist, so I don't worry about that boundary. But it's a complicated relationship, I think.
I don't work with one particular artist, so I find what I do with the installations is I get a lot of inspiration from the different works that I install, and every installation is, you know, fresh and exciting, I think, for the most part. But, you know, that I think you learn something creatively about, you know, that I think you translate into your own work from working with, you know, other people's art. And it's always kind of a puzzle putting stuff together. Installations aren't usually, they're very rarely very straightforward. There's a lot of creative aspects that go into figuring out how something is going to be installed in a space. There's always site-specific things which, you know, I find that kind of problem solving, you know, a really important part of the creative process. And it translates into my own work. You know, my work is, mostly lens-based, mostly photography, but I create my own substrates, and I'm always working with different materials and kind of stretching the boundaries of the way photography is presented. I oxidize aluminum panels and polish them out, and I apply images to broken glass. I do all different types of things. So a lot of ideas come from installations that I work on too. So it's, I feel like it's part of my creative process, doing the installation work.
I agree. It's when I walk into, here and what art are we going to hang? The thing that immediately I start, it's a problem. It's like problem solving to me, and I don't even, strangely enough, don't even look at the art. I look at the art, but I don't see the art. I'm not really, I would have to come back a week later, and I would look at the show, and I would say, wow, this is pretty good, or whatever. I'm all of a sudden seeing stuff that I hadn't. So I like to make stuff, and problem solving has to do with making stuff. So that's what I get out of it.
I think for me, I make paintings, and I love working with other artists and getting to sort of play or execute their work, because it totally alleviates all of the anxiety of being in charge, in a way. And I think with this work in particular, I love making these Jim Lambie installations, because it's so labor-intensive and time-consuming and methodical that it's, for me, I think it's kind of a reminder just to be present in the process of making and enjoying that as much as anticipating the results. So I think for me, the thing I get more and more out of this work is just being really open to an unknown outcome and kind of trusting the flow of a process, and that's been really, really great for me, and it's something that I do in my own work, but I really feel a kind of like a commonality with Jim in that way.
Are there any questions? Yes.
Michelle. I don't know if it's a question, but a strong response. When you were speaking about the analogy of a musical score and maybe being the performer, and then you even used the word notation. I mean, as a musician, when I was in front of Sol LeWitt, I read very briefly the description, and I wanted to ask you if it was similar to a musical score, like the directions of it, because it was just so clear to me. I've never had such a, musicians and visual artists, we often try to find intersection, but we know it's always been, but we're still talking about different things. But what you both have described and all the questions in terms of how do I let the art and the artist speak for itself versus where does my voice? These are things that we spend our whole lives thinking about, and I think it's just so fascinating to me, especially this question now of longevity, because as a violinist in 2024 playing Bach, I'm constantly thinking about, did he even think people were going to be asking these questions? We have this representation of the thing itself with the score, but music is so ephemeral that we're here trying to recreate something, but it's like the thing exists beyond, outside of the actual artwork. And so it's just, all of these concepts are so, it's like speaking the same quizzical language. So it was so fascinating to hear about that. And I guess the only thing I would say is that it's interesting in terms of you are, in my opinion, like a performer, except that a performance happens in a finite moment with an audience, and you can't physically hide. So even though I would spend a lot of my time thinking, well, I want to make sure Bach is coming out and not me, it's inextricable from me. And I was curious if you both feel that. You kind of pointed on this, but being sort of like the
secret performer, I'm curious, I guess there's a question there, like how does that play in now that you have time with the pieces? Sorry to talk so much. This just was so interesting.
I think that Sol really was fascinated by that, by bridging the two-dimensional and four-dimensional, 4D and 2D, that there would be, I think, I heard somewhere that he was influenced by John Cage and Merce Cunningham, but I can't confirm that with any of the art historians, but I feel like I read it somewhere once. And I've often said during the process that the installations are as interesting as, like if you look at the time lapses that are made, they're beautiful in motion, and almost the final object. I mean, it's beautiful also, but as beautiful as, I mean, yeah, it's like the secret performers. Like, sometimes when I'm in people's homes, I'm like, this is the really fun part. Like, this is the part you should be observing. But I guess there's no product in time for these pieces, like a musical performance. You do have the result at the end. But I do think it opens up a lot of really fascinating questions about the potential for painting and drawing and performance, that just those ideas being fleshed out in the future as just sort of philosophical questions.
So, yeah, that was so perfect for you. I can't believe it. But so there's two things then that I take. One is this idea that you're performing on a modern violin. I mean, okay, it might go back to the 1800s, but there are groups that perform with the ancient instruments. So it's all going to go along. You know, there's, who's the guy over in Bridgehampton, Donald Judd's friend? Dan Flavin, like there's the whole thing about his lights as well. They've probably done something. But then there was also and then there's the thing you did, Sara, this guy at the back talking about time, who's on his bicycle drawing in time. So it's just that now that I go along, it's just a brilliant, you know, space right now. I mean, there's so much, and it's so interesting to talk to you guys and gals or whatever about your relationship. I think it's so important. So thank you.
Are there any more questions? Can I put one person on the spot? Lee Skolnick, who is here in the front row, who is the architect of the building. And I think a lot about Lee as I'm installing, because Lee and Joanne have an enormous amount of experience building museums and installing in museums. So I'm always anxious how Lee will react. Lee, when you were building the building, you knew that it was going to be used in very many and different ways. I guess my question to you is, how does it feel now to have had 4 years of exhibitions and events and artists in the space?
Well, is this on? Yes. It feels great. I mean, but what feels great is that over the course of 4 years, there have been so many different kinds of installations here. And what I'm gratified by is that you can come into this space and interpret it yourself. It's not, you know, I often, and this is a catty architect remark, but, you know, if this were designed by Danny Liebeskind, who's, you know, an interesting architect, I went to school with him, you couldn't do this because it's much too specific. And, you know, I always say the process that we went through in designing the space was how little can we do? And that's not far off from, I'm a musician too, and it's not far off from how you compose. It's not that far off from how you do visual art. How can you distill it down to only what's essential? And in the case of architecture, that means creating places that can morph. And, you know, I just love the interaction of, you know, a dynamic piece like that, you know, a sort of dynamic / static piece like this, a static piece like that, and they all work together. And they're not fighting with each other. They have breathing room. And they also, you know, a lot of galleries and museum spaces are white boxes. And a lot of ancient museums or the early museums were not white boxes. I mean, when you go to the Louvre or you go to the Rijksmuseum, you know, we did an installation of Alexander Calder in Cooper Hewitt, the Carnegie Mansion. And you actually go and you have a dialogue between the space and the artwork, which I find so much richer than a white box gallery, because it is a conversation. It's not one side being mute and having its mouth taped over. The space and the work is creating a new experience, and it's a new experience every time. So when you move this piece, as you said, to a different venue like the parish, it's a very different place. It's going to be a different conversation. And Sara has just, as of today or yesterday, completed 2 Sol LeWitt wall drawings in a project of ours in New York. And we knew we wanted Sol LeWitt. I mean, they are environmental. You step off these 3 elevators or 2 elevators, and you are confronted with 20-foot long wall drawing, and it is architecture. And what's really interesting about working with Sol LeWitt is we stood there and we looked at the original design and we said, well, you know, it's not going to work. And so Sara morphed it to work in the space. It's still a Sol LeWitt wall drawing, and it still has the integrity. In fact, they just sent me pictures I was just looking at, and it looks fantastic. But it actually turns the corner. So it was conceived of as one flat piece, but in our space, we had to turn the corner, and it's still what it is, but it's something new and exciting. And that's how I feel about this place. You know, every time I come in here, you know, whether it was the guitars or your next exhibit is on water. So, the one to come? Yeah.
Women in Humor.
Oh, what happened to water?
We did water 2 years ago.
That's right. So, you know, each theme becomes, I'll use the word colored, by the interaction between the two. So I'm talking too much. But it's very exciting for me to see your creative work in my space.
Well, I'd like to thank you for coming, and I'd just like to thank the panel so much for your work installing and also for sharing your time today. Thank you so much.